Good evening, everybody. Ani, Bojo, Sego, Holly, Indigenous Cause. It's so lovely to have you here this evening and to be joined by Waubgeshig Rice, who's here to spend some time and chat with us. Before we get started this evening with the presentation, I would like to introduce Waub Dave Rice, who is here to get us opened in a good way. So Dave, if you want to turn your mic on and you can go ahead and share. And before you get started, Dave, I have some sema here that I would like to present to you to ask you to help us open in a good way.
Okay, I'll open up with Bojo Kinawayak, everyone. It means good evening, everyone. And I'd like to say miigwech for having me here tonight and to open up for my my relative from beautiful Wasak Sing, our the writer Waubgeshig. So I'd like to say miigwech kajamnadoga bajai non gun. Kanagagoga zatstuin. Miigwech nok mustagisis kabajai non gun. Miigwech vishomas visas kabajai non bekik. Miigwech kakni kwag kabajai bamadzwin kabajai mijam kabajai wasayak kabajai nabish kabajai niswin. Meanwhile Nabish, Sama Garabnan, Giwed non, Wabinan, Jaunan, Mino Ashwarinian, not a motion, Gamonstian, meanwhile Gamonstian. Say miigwech for all those beautiful spirits to join us here tonight. And we're here to one mind, one thought, to hear sharing and the knowledge that is going to be brought to us today. So our ancestors come to be a part of that ceremony. I'd like to say, forgive me for I forgot to announce my name. It's Dave, but Bojo Manakami Indigenous Cosmo Quato. I'd like to say miigwech for having me and allowing me to open up for you today, and we'll let everyone start. Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you very much, Dave. I also just want to allow us to bring our minds together and acknowledge that we are coming together from all across Turtle Island. And there are many folks out there watching us live tonight, and we welcome you and are grateful that you're here to join us for this conversation. And I want to express our gratitude for that continued relationship in order to be able to live and work and play here on Turtle Island. I have the honor of living and working in the traditional homeland of the Ojibwe Nation and the Huron-Wendat Nation. And within this territory, I also want to respectfully acknowledge communities from the Watemohawk Nation, the Potawatomi Nation, and the Métis Nation of Ontario. I also specifically want to tonight honor the One Dish with One Spoon Treaty, the Robinson-Huron Treaty, and the Williams Treaty, as well as many unceded and unsurrendered treaty areas where we are all here gathered on this evening. As a treaty person, I am forever committed to and grateful for the enduring relationships with the land, waters, and with all Indigenous peoples who have walked Turtle Island since time immemorial. And I personally commit to doing all that I can to fulfill my role and responsibility as a treaty person, and I acknowledge the stewardship throughout the ages. I'd like to start us off in a good way with those words. I'm honored to introduce to you Chief Philip Franks from the Watemohawks community, who's here with us tonight, and he's going to bring some greetings from community.
Yes, thank you. Sego, 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 Bonjour. Good evening, everyone. It's my honor to be here as the Chief of Watemohawks. Apparently my thing says Franks Angus on there, but maybe you don't see that. Yes, my name is Philip Franks. I'm the elected chief. I know that we've had a relationship going with between ourselves and the Board of Education for many, many years now, and working towards bringing stories and bringing awareness to everybody, not only for Wakta and the Mohawk people, but of all Indigenous people. And so I'm really glad to be here and to welcome Waubgeshig Rice and to commend him for the work he does. And to welcome Waubgeshig Rice and to commend him for the work he does. And to welcome Waubgeshig Rice and to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him for the work he does. And to commend him I was mentioning early before we came on live that I've known members of his family, and they all work towards the good of our people in health or other areas, whether it be spiritual health or mental health, physical health, which I was a part of during my working days. And so I'm so glad that he was able to be here and to share with all of us his talents in helping our minds become more aware and to work and to think. And all of those things together are parts of just pure well-being. So I appreciate Waub being here and look forward to a good evening. So thank you so much. Nyawako.
Chief Franks, thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce you to the trustee chair, Bruce Rayan, who is here to bring some greetings on behalf of the board.
Thank you, Holly. And first of all, big shout out to you and your committee for setting up this whole getting together tonight. Thank you. Welcome to all of you for our 13th annual Indigenous Education Evening. Joint Lakelands District School Board is honored to partner with the Waubgeshig Mohawks to bring Waub Rice here tonight. Indigenous education is a priority here in TLDSB. On behalf of our Board of Trustees, we are grateful for the positive relationships that we have with Indigenous partners and deeply appreciate the work of our Indigenous Education Advisory Committee. Many members of that committee are here this evening, including Trustee Claude and Trustee Saunders. Again, thank you for joining us this evening. We are certainly looking forward to learning alongside you, Waub.
Thank you, Bruce. I'd now like to invite Director Hahn to share a few words.
Thank you, Holly, and good evening, everyone. It certainly is an honor to be part of the 13th Annual Indigenous Education Evening, my first here, and I've heard many great things with all the presentations that have gone on over the last number of years. As a board, we are committed to learning alongside our Indigenous partners. Like Chief Frank said, we've had a great partnership over the years, and that certainly will continue. We truly believe we're a learning organization and want to continue to learn alongside our partners, and it's very, very important to us. I want to thank you, Waub, in advance for being here and speaking about the importance of celebrating and elevating Indigenous voices. We have much to learn from you this evening, and we'll continue our journey learning from the past, the present, to ensure all our students can be seen in the curriculum, and that's really important to us. So welcome.
Thank you, Director Hahn. I'd now like to ask Superintendent of Learning, Jennifer Johnston, who is responsible for Indigenous Ed, to please share a few words and to introduce Waub.
Thank you, Holly. What a great night to be here together. In all of 13 years, this is the first time that we've pivoted to a virtual event. And so it has drawn about 400 registrations. And so we are live streaming this evening. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize those who organized this event. Firstly, our partnership with Waubgeshig Mohawks. Our partnership with you has helped to make tonight possible, so thank you very much. Our Indigenous Education Consultant, Holly Groom, who's also our facilitator this evening. Thank you, Holly, for all of your hard work to pull this together. We have Wendy Brown online as well. Wendy has done a lot of the coordinating of our registrations. And we can't do a virtual event without the help of Chris Tyndale. He's also on the line to make sure that the live streaming goes smoothly this evening. So thank you very much to all of you. And now to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Originally from Waubgeshig First Nation, Waubgeshig Rice is an award-winning author and journalist whose writing is inspired by his experiences growing up in an Anishinaabe community. A graduate of Ryerson University's journalism program, he has worked in a variety of news media and hosted Up North, CBC's radio's afternoon show for Northern Ontario. His latest novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, has received many accolades, and he's currently working on the sequel, we hear. And so Waub, Holly does have a tobacco tie to present to you this evening. there it is, the wonders of virtual tonight. And Waub, we truly appreciate you sharing your journey with us this evening. Holly and I, we do have some questions, and we'll be monitoring the chat to facilitate a Q&A after your presentation. So welcome to you, Waub.
Oh, Chimiigwech, Superintendent Johnson, and big thanks to you all for welcoming me this evening. It's an honor to be a guest of the Trillium Lakelands District School Board for your annual event. I am very honored and humbled to be a part of this, and I thank you all for taking time out of your evening to hang out with me. I will let you know I'm out in my backyard, and the Sudbury Hospital is just down this way, and once in a while an orange helicopter will fly over, but that may be some noise you hear in the background here and there. But I would like to take a moment just to introduce myself briefly. Bonjour, Sego, bonjour, hello, Waubgeshig Indigenous, Makwando Dem, Wasaksing Don Chaba, Nishnabe Minwa Jagana Shinda, Swakamak and Dida. Hi, everybody. I am Waubgeshig Rice. You may feel free to call me Waub for short as we're chatting. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe of Wasaksing First Nation. I'm of Anishinaabe and Canadian descent. My dad is from Wasaksing and my mom is from Parry Sound, Ontario. And I currently reside in Sudbury, which is also known as Swakamuck, the traditional territory of the Atikamekw and Anishinaabe. And these lands where I currently reside and where I grew up are all under the Robinson-Huron Treaty, which was signed in 1850. And of course, that is a treaty that predates Canadian Confederation. I just want to acknowledge my relative, Dave Shkabewis Minokme, for his kind introduction. Dave, we call ourselves cousins, but Dave is very much an uncle to me. He has been a very empowering and motivating force in my life. And it is really an honor to be introduced by him because he has done so much important work in our community to make sure that our youth grow up to be kind and generous and respectful Anishinaabe. And I feel that I've benefited from Dave's leadership over the course of my life. So Chimiigwech, Dave, for your kind intro. And I really want to acknowledge Chief Franks and the entire Wata community. From an early age, I remember visiting Wata, and it was part of some of that outreach between our community and yours. And I remember learning about dancing around the circle the opposite way. In the Anishinaabe go clockwise and our Mohawk relatives go counterclockwise. I remember the first time I saw that, I was like, okay, this is what intersectional sort of cross-cultural learning is all about. That's what we do as Indigenous people. It's how we learn about our different ways of life. So having that opportunity at a young age really opened my eyes to the diverse realities of Indigenous people. And I'm just really grateful that I had that learning very early on, and that, this relationship is ongoing. And hopefully I'll have an opportunity to visit you all at the board in person someday, but also to visit the Wata community. So it is really cool to have these connections ongoing all these years later. Tonight, I'll basically talk a little bit about my career as both an author and a journalist, but I understand a lot of you will have a lot of questions about some various things related to my career or to media or to my background as an Anishinaabe person, or what it was like moving from the res to the city and so on. So I'll keep my opening comments somewhat brief because I know that Holly and Jennifer have some questions. And I do want to say big thanks to Holly for setting this all up, for inviting me to share. I was really pleased to see how this all unfolded, and I just feel very humbled to have this opportunity. So Chimiigwech for your hard work, Holly. I feel very warmly welcomed, even though we're doing this all through a screen virtually, right? I do feel like we're having a nice visit together as friends and friends to become. So like to start off, I think I am on this journey now because of what I learned as a child growing up in my community about my Anishinaabe heritage. And I grew up in a time in the 1980s when our community was really making concerted efforts to reclaim Anishinaabe culture and customs and reconnect with our history that had been taken from us. And I feel myself and my wider generation and the younger ones are major beneficiaries of that widespread effort to reconnect. And that really is what empowered me specifically, and I can only speak for myself, of course, to learn about our culture and our stories and to apply that knowledge and those practices to my educational and professional career, in hopes of, amplifying Indigenous voices, but also learning about being Indigenous myself. So this journey for me has been obviously beneficial personally, but I believe it's really helped widen the circle, in terms of bringing non-Indigenous people in to learn about our realities. And of course, I don't take credit for that at all. I give the credit entirely to the generations that came before me, the ones who made space for us, who blazed trails and ensured that we grew up as vibrantly talented and aware young Nishnabek. And I believe it is my responsibility to keep that going. And I always try to ensure that I am helping guide the younger generations on the path that has been laid out before me and that I try to maintain at the same time. So part of that learning back in the 1980s was, sitting at the drum, learning how to sing songs, learning how to dance around the drum, in various powwow styles. And Dave will remember, like, back in those days, we didn't have any drums in our community, right? They were either destroyed or taken by the Indian agents or hidden away and never found again. And that's a result of the Indian Act, right? The Indian Act forbade culture in our communities. And there was a specific person, an Indian agent, employed to uphold the Indian Act and fine or arrest people for doing the things that were forbidden under the Indian Act. And that included cultural gatherings, that included ceremonies and so on, right? So when our community decided it wanted to get back to those ways of life, there were no drums around. So what happened was, Dave was probably there with my dad and some of those guys. They went down to Aurelia and they bought a big bass drum from a pawn shop. And that was like the first drum that I learned how to sing and drum on, right? Using drumsticks that were made out of tent poles and fishing poles with foam tied around the end. So I always say, like, that was a real sort of punk rock way to get back into the old songs, because it was a very do-it-yourself kind of initiative, right? But that's how I really connected with being Anishinaabe. And what came along with that was the stories that the elders would come in and share with us. So a really important thing that happened for me and my generation was in our school, in our community, our school was called Ryerson Indian Day School, and it was only for junior and senior kindergarten. And back in those days, the kids would go to this day school on reserve, and then once they were done to go to grade 1, they'd go into Parry Sound for the rest of their schooling, right? But when this sort of movement happened in the early 1980s to reclaim culture, the older generation, like my parents and their peers and the elders, started to lobby to expand our school on the reserve. So they advocated for funding, and they eventually got control of that sort of educational administration, and they were able to expand the school up to grade 8. So I was amongst the first cohort of kids that graduated from grade 8 in our reserve school. And the name changed from Ryerson Indian Day School to Wasauksing Ginomalgeogamik, which means Wasauksing School. So part of that autonomy and that sovereignty was ensuring that we had time for cultural learning. So that meant bringing in elders specifically to tell us stories or to teach us about our culture. But also it was very informal at the same time, in that if an elder just happened to be walking down the road and they wanted to come in and hang out with the kids, they would make time for that too. So like if we're in math class and all of a sudden, an elder knocked on the door, comes in, it was like, okay, put the math books away, right? It's story time with the elder, which is really awesome. But I learned early on just how crucial that storytelling element was in terms of preserving our culture and ensuring that we were aware of who we were as Anishinaabe. And I tried to remember those stories, like even, when I was 6, 7, 8 years old, because I knew they were important. And I really, tried to ensure that I would keep them close to me so that I could pass it down to future generations in the future, So that storytelling foundation was laid at a pretty early age for me. By the time I graduated from grade 8 and had to go to high school, though, I went to high school off reserve, obviously. I saw a really different approach to storytelling that I thought was, interesting, but quite the opposite of what I'd understood as storytelling as a kid. So in high school, you have English class, right? And in grade 9 English, I became familiar with that really formal way of engaging with stories. And that is, you read a book, you put your head down and have this sort of solitary, even isolating experience of reading a book, right? And I still really appreciated and enjoyed it nonetheless, but I found it really strange and quite different. And of course, I was familiar with books. Of course, we learned about books on the school and the res, but the storytelling component was different, as I mentioned. So I'd read these books, and then we'd sometimes talk about it in class and so on. But the whole idea was we would learn about these stories on our own and interpret them on our own and so on. And I thought back to my childhood and those storytelling experiences, and they were very communal and collective. We would sit on the floor and look up at an elder and engage with the story together. We would laugh together or cry together and so on. But then going into the more formal education system of secondary, it was just all by yourself, So I was like, okay, this is just a different way of doing things. And as, the reading lists went on throughout grades 9, 10, 11, I only saw books by white authors, usually white men, and they were usually dead, these dudes who are long gone, right? So I just thought, okay, and the way that the sort of curriculum sets it up is that, the book is the pinnacle of storytelling expression. That is the highest form of storytelling that you can get. That's how the system presents it to you, right? And because we'd only read these books by white men, I thought, okay, well, that is not a realm for me. I did not read any Indigenous experiences written by Indigenous authors. So I thought, okay, the stories I heard growing up aren't part of this. And I just accepted it. This is the early 1990s, and there wasn't a whole lot of resistance or even revolution in terms of cultural learning within that formal system, So I thought, okay, that's just the way it is. I will keep engaging with this method of storytelling. I will do my best. I'll try to get my best marks. And nonetheless, I enjoyed it, right? I really liked reading and creative writing. But by the time I got to about grade 11, one of my aunties, one of Dave's relatives as well, her name was Elaine Kelly. She was one of our first teachers on the reserve school. And she always took a keen interest in our education after we graduated from grade 8, right? She always checked in with us pretty regularly. And one day, we're hanging out at my grandmother's house for some kind of family function. And she said, hey, Waub, how's school going? And I was like, oh, yeah, it's going good. And, I'm getting good marks and enjoying it, blah, blah, blah. And she said, oh, yeah, what's your favorite class? And I said, oh, it's English class. And she said, oh, yeah, why is that? And I said, well, I really like reading. I like the creative writing assignments. Those are really cool. And she said, oh, yeah, that's cool. What books are you reading? What authors? And I said, oh, like Shakespeare and J.D. Salinger and W.O. Mitchell and Sir William Golding and so on, right? And she just kind of went, oh, okay. And sort of left it at that, And that's just the way my aunt was, She got the information she needed and sort of went off to do what she wanted with it, kind of thing. But after that, she started giving me books by Indigenous authors for my birthday and for Christmas and even just randomly, books by Thomas King and Richard Waughemes, Lee Miracle, Louise Erdrich, Maria Campbell, all these authors who are already out there writing important works of Indigenous literature and really blazing that trail that I eventually ended up on. And I just wasn't familiar with them at all through the education system, and it totally blew me away. It opened my eyes to this entirely different way of telling stories. And what I saw were not just my own experiences as an Anishinaabe person reflected back to me from the page. I saw these universal elements of the realities of Indigenous people that could bring people together just by writing them down and sharing them en masse, And, you know, it's how I learned about the 60 Scoop through like Keeper and Me by Richard Waugemi's. It was from 1994, right? It's where I saw like the humor of our stories really expertly portrayed in books like Green Grass Running Water by Thomas King. It's where I saw sort of the brutalities of the colonial existence in stories like Raven Song by Lee Maracle, and in Tracks by Louise Erdrich, and so on. And it was just totally empowering for me to know that that was a viable outlet for me, for my storytelling. And it was not something that I learned in the classroom, not at all. You know, I didn't have teachers showing me that back when I was a teenager in the 1990s in the formal Ontario education system. So I was like, well, this is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to write, and I'm going to hopefully one day become a published author. And nowadays, when I think back, you know, I was very fortunate to have this aunt who showed me that way. But I had, as I mentioned, I had accepted that that wasn't a place for me. And I had never entertained the idea of pursuing that as an artistic expression for myself until I had an aunt show me that. And I think about all my peers and just Indigenous people or Black people or other artists of color who grew up in the same time, who never had that opportunity, who didn't fortunately have an aunt to show them what really could be, you know? And I think as a result, Canada has missed out, and we're really only just starting to catch up now to what some of the actual diverse experiences of living in this country really are. So again, I feel very fortunate. I had an aunt show me that. I shouldn't have learned from a family member outside of the education system. I should have learned from a teacher, but that's just how it went for me, you know? So I am encouraged and empowered nowadays to see kids at the high school level learning about Indigenous authors and other authors from so-called marginalized communities, because that is how we will get to a place of really understanding what Canada really is and what it really has been, because we have not, none of us have been shown the reality of Canada whatsoever. And we are seeing that unfold in real time right now as these revelations come out about mass graves at residential school sites, you know? And those of us from Indigenous communities have known about that since we were young. You know, those stories about residential schools have always come with those grim facts. That's just part of your upbringing as an Indigenous person if you grow up close to some of those people who have experienced those things, you know? So these revelations, you know, aren't shocking to me or to people in my circles because it's widespread knowledge already. But unfortunately, it takes like the big shock for other Canadians to make these things really catalyze change finally, right? And those books that I mentioned, you know, they detail all these things. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission 6 years ago detailed all these things, right? So, you know, we will get to a place where we understand the reality of this country and the true history of it. And getting to that place, you know, is not about assigning blame or guilt to anybody. It's about understanding, you know, how bad things have been to ensure that they don't repeat for future generations. You know, I think anybody wants a good harmonious coexistence on this land, no matter who they are or where they come from, you know? And a big part of that is accepting the truth. And that's really, really hard for a lot of people because we've really been spoon-fed this myth about Canada for generations and generations, right? And, you know, I think Canadians are finally realizing that none of that was really true, that history was written just by one group of people, you know? But, you know, we do have these opportunities now. We have these wonderful chances to get together and learn together as fellow Canadians and hopefully ensure that our young people grow up with that wider knowledge. And as a dad now, I have two little boys, age 4 and 1. I'm very hopeful. I already see a different world that they're growing up in compared to the one that I grew up in. Back in the 80s and 90s. So that's what encourages me. That's what empowers me. Being a part of this gathering tonight is really what encourages me as well. Because I don't think this kind of thing would have happened even 10 years ago. You know, I don't think there would have been interest in an Indigenous author coming in to speak to an entire school board about their experiences. Were it not for the TRC, were it not for the Idle No More movement and so on. You know, we would have been stuck doing these things in our pockets of community and hopefully sharing this knowledge with the allies nearby who took a vested interest in learning about these things properly too, but to see learning happen at a formal sort of widespread level is great. I am encouraged as a father, as an Indigenous person who hopefully still has half my life left. I'm 42 now, so hopefully I still have, hopefully I'm just at the halfway point now. I'm excited to see what happens next, and the fact that there are books, as I mentioned earlier, by Indigenous authors being studied in the classroom. Like, to me, knowing that my most recent novel, Moon of the Crested Snow, is read and discussed at the classroom level is really the coolest thing. It is the greatest honor for me, because I was that age, not knowing that's what I needed, but that's exactly what I needed, and I had, this outside influence that brought me on that path. But to know that there are kids like me, and kids not like me at the same time, who have the opportunity to engage with these stories in these profound ways is just the coolest, and I give thanks every day that I have these opportunities to share my stories, and that young people, especially in a lot of parts of our land, are reading my book. It's just really neat. So just last thoughts before we start having a discussion is like, books are great resource to learn about, through fiction and through nonfiction, to learn about history and to learn about everyday experiences and so on. I think they are essentially a good starting point, though. I would always urge people to go out and try to form real life relationships with people that they may not necessarily be familiar with. And I think you would find most Indigenous communities and cultures are totally open to having people come in and learn about their history and their ways of life. That's why we have powwows. That's why we invite everybody to them. That's why we make time to tell our stories if someone shows an interest in them and so on like that. So, that's all I'll share, from that perspective for now. And I'll throw it back to Holly and Jennifer, and we can just have a chat.
Waub, thank you for that. It's really great to hear your story and just get to know you a little bit better as you share through that. And I think, I had a ton of questions and thoughts coming to me as you were sharing. And one of the pieces that really stands out to me so much is, as you described, sitting and learning from elders and knowledge keepers together in that sense of community that is created by hearing the teachings together, and how that really can change a young person, and you allow your peers, you grow together because you're having that shared experience. And so I was also reflecting on you talking about the number of schools now and classrooms that are reading your book. And so even though it's a Western vehicle, that European vehicle of the actual book, I feel like through you, we are building community, and that community is growing across the province and across the country and all over Turtle Island because of what it is that you're bringing. And so I just wanted to say thank you for that. That's really great. And that really resonated with me.
Oh, my gosh. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and Holly, on that note, we do have someone who wrote a question for Waub, someone who's a fan of your book, Waub, Moon of the Crested Snow. And so I'll read the question. There are many parallels between the dystopian future that you write about in Moon of the Crested Snow and what we are going through now in the pandemic. Were these parallels intentional? Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose to write about this topic?
That's a great question. No, that's all entirely coincidental. I had always wanted to write a dystopian / post-apocalyptic book, and I, finally put my mind to it. I guess I would say about 10 years ago, when I just sort of started developing the story, and I started writing it actually in about 2015. But that book was inspired by the big blackout back in 2003. I think some of you remember that. I was living in Toronto at the time, working as a freelance journalist, but that day I was back home in Wisconsin with my brothers. We were house sitting for our dad and stepmom. So the blackout happened, and we eventually learned that it was this big widespread event, and that was potentially impacting like tens of millions of people in all the big cities. And we went right into survival mode right away. Like, we started doing an inventory of all the cans of food in, you know, our dad and stepmom's cupboard, and all the food in the fridge that was going to go bad. And then we like started gathering firewood from out back in case that's how we'd have to cook our food, because there's an electric oven in the kitchen that was useless, you know. And we started thinking about like all the people around us who we could help or who could help us. And it was like really, really comforting to be at home in my community at that time, compared to the big city, because I knew that if that crisis went on for much longer in the city, it could be potentially deadly and really, really chaotic, you know? So I always thought about that sort of dichotomy between experiencing a blackout on the res and in the city. And I wanted to write about that. And I wanted that to be sort of the end of the world moment. And I was inspired, you know, I talk about what I didn't see in high school and what I wanted to see, but I also did learn a lot from what was in the curriculum in terms of like the dystopian books in sort of like grade 11, grade 12, like 1984 and Brave New World and Fahrenheit 451, and even Lord of the Flies. I, you know, was talking smack about William Golding earlier. Still learned a lot from that book, you know. Yeah, so those two things, like experiencing the blackout on the res and being a fan of dystopian / post-apocalyptic literature, is really what I wanted to write about. I wanted to sort of hone in on this story. So that's where the inspiration came from. But the timing, again, was totally coincidental. And the book itself came out in 2018. So it had a decent first run. You know, it got, you know, some good reviews, and I got to tour it around a lot. But then the pandemic happened like 14 months ago or 13 months ago or so, and sort of added a second wind to the book. And it's interesting to see, it was interesting to see that unfold, because like I started thinking about like, why do people want to read books like this at this time when everything's so confusing and so scary? And I started thinking about the books that people gravitated towards, you know, like Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, or The Marathis by Sri Dimaline, or American War by Omar Al-Akkad. And I thought, well, those books, you know, as scary as they are about the end of the world, they all have a resolution. And usually when you're getting into a story like that, you know it's going to end some way, whether it's bad or good. You know, you're hoping for a good outcome when you're, you know, getting deep into a story like that. And I think that's what people wanted in that kind of art, whether it was books or movies or whatever else. Because a year ago at this point, like even in June of last year, like we still didn't have a vaccine. We didn't know how these lockdowns would come back or resolve or anything like that. So I think that's what people really gravitated towards. But, you know, there were a few like interesting parallels. Like I wrote about like the food being bought up at the grocery stores, and about like people, well, if you've read Moon of the Crescent Snow, you'll know that the main antagonist comes up from a city to the south. And we saw during the pandemic, people flying to remote Indigenous communities to seek refuge, you know, that actually happened, right? So there were some interesting parallels for sure. But no, to answer that question, it was entirely coincidental. But I do appreciate people who took interest in it, you know, and I would never say that I am grateful to benefit during this time, because it has been a really hard time for basically the entire world. But if I was able to provide comfort to people through that story, I'm glad I was able to give that to the world at the same time, you know? So, yeah, so, I mean, as it ends and as I like, you know, get my head back into that story to write the sequel, you know, this pandemic is always going to be a pretty major moment for me. So I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up 2003, because the babies born in 2003 are graduating high school this year.
Wow.
I only know that because my youngest was born in 2003, so I remember it really well.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. So we have another person, a high school English teacher, who's written a question, and this person is saying that they've been using Indigenous literature in their English classes for some time, but struggling with the role of educator from European descent. And so this person is describing a sense of the stories aren't the teacher's own stories to tell, and not really feeling confident about getting it right and worried about making a mistake. Should someone like this teacher, she's asking for your advice, just do their best, knowing it's probably, it will be better than not teaching these books. She knows there's not a right or wrong answer, but interested to know what you think on that.
Yeah, that's really good sort of mindset to be in, and I really appreciate that question. I would say do your best. The fact that you're considering it and using stories in books like mine is a huge progression, considering where we'd been 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I would go back to what Holly mentioned earlier about using the vehicle of the book to get culture and experiences out there. Like, keep in mind, we are using, and I say we in terms of Indigenous authors or storytellers, like, we are using the language and the formats of the colonizers to get our stories out there. Of course, we're using them to unite other Indigenous people and to bring us all together. But, the fact that we're employing this format means that we're bringing other people in as well. And I don't want to speak for everybody, but that's how I sort of perceive it, So that's why it's there. It's written in English in a book form for people who know how to read English, no matter what their background is, and that is a way to sort of break into that world at the same time. That is a way for me to enter the classroom by showing the stories and experiences that I'm familiar with. So yes, by all means, any non-Indigenous educator, I think if the book is written in English or in French or whatever other European language or colonizing language or whatever else, then yes, that's what it's there for. It's there for educational purposes, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Waub, for that. It gets me connecting really to another question that's come up from some of our listeners out there tonight, and really just sort of thinking and wondering about the preparation in order to bring Indigenous literature into a classroom, whether it be English or any other for that matter, because we know that there's so much to learn, and there's so many intersections in just understanding the truth and our history that you spoke about in the beginning when you were sharing with us. And so there was a couple of questions that had around the theme of in order to do a good job of bringing an Indigenous text into a classroom, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about to prep ahead of time and make sure that we have some of those conversations with students so it feels contextual and it feels like they have a full picture?
That's a really good question. Well, I would say before you sort of dive into the fiction world, definitely try to learn as much as you can through media or nonfiction works or whatever else, right? And you can go to excellent resources like the TRC's final report or its calls to action, or the countless other reports that have been written about Indigenous issues and so on. But mainstream media, not just mainstream, but the media that's out there about Indigenous people mostly is really good in terms of teaching people about real life experiences. And I always feel like I was able to get on a path of fiction writing through my journalism experience by getting to know so many real people over the years and what their experiences were. So I would say, yeah, like look up documentaries, especially, or listen to CBC specials. Look online to see what's available in terms of getting your head around what some of the ongoing issues are. And the way I see fiction especially complementing that is fiction can, even though it's about characters that aren't real, that are entirely dreamt up, it can get to the truth in some more effective ways than I think journalism can. And mostly that's because there aren't really many limits applied to fiction. There are ways that you can really take a deep dive into something and really get into some finer nuances about what these issues really are through fiction. So I think, and I'll take residential schools as an example. Like there is so much great journalism out there about the residential school experience. CBC has done great work, APTN, and so on. So I would look up what some of those real anecdotes are. And then, when you start reading about it in fiction, it really can, you can really learn from details that maybe don't necessarily make it into like a documentary or a news report and so on. And just off the top of my head, I think of Michelle Good's recent novel, Five Little Indians. I think that is one of the best books ever created in this land, because again, there is so much great material about the residential school experience out there, but she uses fiction to follow these fictional characters over the entire course of their lives and how that residential school experience has impacted these people, right? So it's just a really cool way of getting into those details and nuances, as I said. But yeah, to answer that question, seek out the journalism that's out there before, if you're unsure, if you want to learn more, before engaging in the books.
Thank you. It makes me think about something that you mentioned as you were introducing yourself too, and you know, you're following your journey and your path of leaving the community and becoming a journalist and moving to an urban center. And you know, as I connect with many friends, Indigenous friends and family members, and understand that there has been a real shift and movement towards folks living in urbanized centers. And I wonder if you would just share a little bit about your own experience about leaving the community and moving into an urban center, and what that has been like, and you know, maybe just share some thoughts about that, and about your connection to your community now, even though you're not able to be there all the time.
Yeah, well, you know, back then in the 90s, I think there was a real drive to, I mean, if you graduated from high school and you lived in your community, the sort of expectation was that you were going to go to college or university no matter what, right? And that's what my family always expected of me. And, you know, it seemed like a good decision on my part then. And I enjoyed it. I am glad that I made that decision. I first moved to Toronto, obviously, to go to university at Ryerson, which we are now calling X University, and we can talk about that later if you're all interested, to study journalism there. And it was exciting to go to Toronto because it was a big smoke. I really wanted to be a 19-year-old kid in the city. You know, it was kind of thrilling. But that really was the move off the community for me, and I've lived in cities ever since. You know, I've lived in Ottawa, Winnipeg, and now Sudbury, right? So, you know, I do feel that detachment from my upbringing because I did grow up in the bush. I did grow up with some pretty decent land-based skills. I grew up with my culture around me all the time. I grew up with easy access to the language, but I don't have that as much anymore since I've lived in the city. Being in Sudbury now is great because, you know, this is not far from where I grew up, and the Anishinaabe that I'm descended from are all, you know, very similar here, right? Like the culture is pretty much the same that I grew up with, but at the same time, like, I had opportunities, I think, to learn my language fluently when I was younger, and I didn't take them seriously enough. And that's going to be my regret until the day I die. You know, I'm going to work hard to try to learn that fluently eventually, but it's just, I don't have that hands-on sort of capability that I did when I was a teenager. So in that sense, that I maybe don't necessarily think it was the best move to leave the community, if that's what I value, if that cultural and linguistic knowledge is what I value, you know. But at the same time, I was able to create a fun and good career by leaving. So it's like, it's hard. It's hard to discuss it. Like, it's, you know, I'll feel one way about it one day and another way the next day, kind of thing, right? But, you know, I don't regret the pursuing those different sort of professional goals because I was able to make something of them, I guess, you know. But fortunately now, and one of the big reasons behind moving to Sudbury was to be closer to home. So so yeah, I hope to maybe settle there for good someday, but you know, it's still a long ways off. But yeah, I may feel differently about it tomorrow if you ask me the same thing, but these are the things that go through your head all the time, you know?
Mm-hmm. For sure. I'm glad for sharing that and for being so honest with us about it. Yeah, thank you. We had someone.
I was going to say, I saw the question in the chat. There is another musical question that I might tie into a little bit later, Jay. So we will get to your question in a minute. But Waub, there is another fan of your book. Some people are wondering, when will the new book be coming out? You may not have an answer to that. I don't know.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be out in the fall of 2022. That is the schedule. I submitted the first draft to my editor a few weeks ago. I haven't heard back from him yet, so I don't know what he really thinks of it. The delay could be a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and then there was another question about Moon on the Crusted Snow, and this person is saying, I loved that book. And they're asking about the Indigenous community that you describe in the book, is described as not being originally from Northern Ontario, but have been forcibly relocated there. And so this person is wondering, could you share a little bit more about what inspired this aspect of that book?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was dreaming up the story, I originally was going to make the community much like where I'm from, you know, in central Ontario, like close to where you all are. But I thought, you know, if I want to build this tension throughout, and I want to make it this really suspenseful end of the world story, you know, a community that's just a 2-hour drive north of Toronto is either gonna like totally fall apart much quicker, or it's going to, you know, fight back, and there's going to be even more violence and so on. So like, I didn't see it really being able to sort of breathe in the way that I wanted to by placing it down in the area that we're all from. So I had to really think long and hard about it, and I thought, well, how about, you know, I place it a little more remotely up north, and try to build the tension that way. So that was a tough decision to make too, because I'm not from a far northern community. I can't speak directly to that experience. You know, I can speak all about growing up in an Anishinaabe community where we're from, but the day-to-day realities of living in a so-called isolated place, I can't exactly speak to. So I really relied on a lot of the research and work I did as a CBC journalist. I spent a lot of time in communities in Northern Ontario and Northern Manitoba. So, you know, I have that firsthand knowledge. But what I did after I wrote, you know, the first couple of drafts is I shared it with friends and acquaintances who are from fly-in communities, just to make sure I had those details done respectfully and properly, I think. So, you know, we hear a lot about like sensitivity reads in literature. It applies to Indigenous people writing about different Indigenous things too, you know. I didn't want to get that wrong because I didn't want to disrespect anybody who's from a community much farther north. So that's how I did that. And the reality of it being displaced from like the Georgian Bay area to far northern Ontario, like that's many communities across the land were displaced hundreds of kilometers away. You know, we could think of all kinds of different examples where that happened, right? So that's not outside the realm of possibility, and that's sort of what I based that on as well. But you know, to answer the question more basically, yeah, I put it up north just to make it a, you know, more suspenseful story, and I think that you know, having visitors come in from the outside is what really sort of upped those stakes at the same time. So yeah, that's why I did that.
Nice. So we will move into the chat pod questions now. And so Superintendent McJanet on the line, he said, you've stated you listen to music before you begin to write. Can you explain your music inspirations and when you write, and how Indigenous music might inspire you?
Yeah, I well, before I write, I usually try to listen to something that'll get me in the right mindset for whatever I'm about to write. So for Moon of the Crested Snow, it was mostly songs that lyrically had to do with like speculative fiction or, you know, dystopia or the apocalypse or whatever else, right? But like during the actual writing process, I definitely need something a little more ambient or non-lyrical, because if I hear lyrics in English, then I'm just going to get distracted, right? So I tend to listen to something more instrumental, usually more ambient, instrumental, heavy metal, like loud aggressive stuff. But interesting you should mention this. With this recent one, the sequel, I've been listening mostly to Tempo on CBC Music, which is the classical show every morning. And I don't know, it's just what's been working for me, listening to classical music. So yeah, but it's a big part of the process for me. Mostly just because I'm a big fan of music. I like all kinds, and you know, I see it as artistic inspiration at the same time too. You know, like it builds a mood, it sets a tone, and so on. So but yeah, so the main soundtrack for the sequel is entirely classical music, basically.
Yeah. And so have you ever written any song lyrics? Have you gone that way in your writing?
No, not really. I mean, I play guitar and I enjoy, you know, having fun with music. But no, I've never really written lyrics. I don't consider myself like a poet. I leave the nice poetry to the poets themselves. And I'm inspired by that too. I read a lot of poetry when I'm trying to write at the same time. But yeah, no, that's maybe I consider it down the line. But for now, I'm still learning how to do fiction, right? So I want to get that right before I branch off into anything else.
Well, maybe the next question might be, who would sing the soundtrack of your life? What band would sing the Waub story?
Oh, geez, I don't know. I would have to think about that.
You'll have to think about that. That's fair enough. Fair enough. We have another question here, and it's from Director Hahn. Is there a role for you in developing documentaries or any other forms of media that could be used to help with the sharing of Indigenous stories with educators and students?
Yeah, not at the moment. I did a bit of that when I was at CBC. I had some good opportunities to create some more long form stuff. There was a show that came out about 10 years ago called The Eighth Fire, which was hosted by Waub Canoe. I was a consultant and a producer on that, so that was really fun. I used to work on a CBC show called Revision Quest too. It was a radio show about 10 years ago at the same time. It was more of a comedy show that was geared at busting myths and stereotypes about Indigenous people. I think you might still be able to find some of the episodes out there, but they're really educational too. What else? Yeah, so I did a bit of that at CBC, but I would like to do a little more, like independently, because you know at CBC I was that was just like things I got to do on the side. You know, I would get permission to leave my daily duties to do these longer form things. So like if I was able to do it on my own, I'd, you know, spend more time on that, right? But in terms of like what I aspire to do additionally, screenwriting for sure. Like I do want to get into, you know, writing shows and writing movies and that kind of thing. So and yeah, it's just it interests me in terms of like another artistic expression. I enjoy watching TV shows and movies. So in terms of sharing Indigenous realities that way, would be fun. So I hope to get more experience doing that.
I'm curious to just shift our conversation slightly for a second, because it's come up a couple of times now in some questions that are coming into us, as you mentioned, the university formerly known as Ryerson. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, you know, about that. And it wasn't lost on me that the day school in the community was also named after the same individual. And so I'm sure there's some thoughts as well that could come from that.
Yeah, well, my educational journey did this weird circle. Started with Ryerson and ended with Ryerson, right? And you know, as a kid, obviously I had questions about who Ryerson was, and my parents told me. But you know, at a young age, they just said, "Oh, he was a guy who helped make the education system and so on," right? But you know, also informed me that he didn't have that great of a reputation amongst Indigenous people. And then, like in a careful way, as I got older, they told me about residential schools and his role in that and so on. But thankfully, around the same time is when our school changed names from Ryerson to Wasauksing Kinomagelgamik. So then when it came time to decide where to go to university, it was either Ryerson or Carleton, just for journalism, because at the time, those were the only two universities in Ontario that offered an undergrad journalism program. So I got accepted to both, and I chose Ryerson just because I wanted to be in Toronto mostly, right? Because it was closer to home, but also because Toronto was a little more exciting than Ottawa, you know. No shade to Ottawa, because I also lived there and loved it there too. But when I was 19, I definitely wanted to be in Toronto more than Ottawa. So it was tough. It was like, okay, you know, do I go back to the school named after this guy that has a very bad legacy? How do I reconcile that? And, you know, obviously talk to my parents about it and to other family members and friends and so on. And, you know, that's just sort of the decision-making process almost every Indigenous person is faced with, is like, you have to sort of weigh your values against history in some ways, you know, or weigh your aspirations against history too. And it's like a paradox that you're constantly entwined in. Of, you know, and this goes back to like leaving the community and going to school in the city at the same time. You know, there's all these big decisions we're faced with that, you know, ultimately end in some kind of compromise, you know. And that was the compromise for me, was go to this journalism school at this university that was named for this guy who is responsible for you know, who created the sort of document for residential schools, essentially, right? So, you know, all the time I was there, though, like the Indigenous peers and friends that I made, you know, we all had the same thoughts around that, and our sort of conclusion was, well, he would not have wanted us here anyway, so we may as well succeed in spite of him, you know, get our degrees in this place where he would never have wanted us. So that was very motivating at the same time too. But yeah, I walked by that statue almost every day the whole 4 years I was there, and didn't like it, of course, and hoped that something would happen eventually. So, you know, and I won't say Ryerson University anymore. I'll just say X University, because that's what students and faculty there have done to hopefully encourage the administration to eventually change the name. So, yeah, to see the statue taken down, the people have essentially spoken, and I think that will hopefully catalyze some meaningful discussions finally within the university. There have been platitudes over the years, but hopefully something big changes now. So yeah, it's been interesting to see those discussions happen for sure.
It certainly, you know, is been echoing across all of Turtle Island as well, with sort of really asking us all to sit back and challenge who we think heroes really should be, you know, and really question that for sure. There's another question that has come up from our small group folks here, and the question is around wondering how educators can decolonize their classroom, specifically as it connects to your experience going to Wasauksing for elementary school. Is there anything from that you may have gleaned that you think would be a benefit to a public or a provincial school?
Yeah, I think it would take like a major ideological overhaul, but the big difference is, as I mentioned earlier, you know, were the flexibility and the rigidity of either place. When I was going to school on the reserve, again, we made time to walk in the bush with an elder if we needed to, or to allow them in to share stories and knowledge with us. But in like the formal high school system, like there's a bell that you got to follow, and there's like marks you got to hit throughout the semester and so on. So if there's a way, you know, I would urge educators to try to be a little more flexible in the delivery of knowledge and how students retain it, and giving them opportunities to learn in different ways, whether that be out in the bush or on their own at home when they need to be, and so on. But again, like, we're so conditioned, like in this capitalist system, to abide by the clock and to sustain that learning within these periods, right? Within that timetable on the calendar and so on. So yeah, again, you know, I'm not an educator, so I'm not the expert here at all. I'm just, you know, a guy who went to school, who, you know, is still connected with school communities and so on. But, you know, hopefully like this pandemic experience, allows us to think differently about education. And I know it's been super tough. And, you know, my heart goes out to all you educators who have been trying to teach during this really tough time. Like, I saw it on my end as our son really struggled with online school, you know, and I saw his teachers struggling as well. And I know it's been really, really hard for everybody, but hopefully, you know, this will spark some changing discussions, and maybe we'll be able to look at education a little differently at the end of all this. But yeah, to decolonize the classroom, I think it's not, you know, as simple as, you know, allowing a smudge. That's great. That is important to do. or putting up like a poster with the medicine wheel on it or something like that. I think it's just about thinking about different ways to deliver teaching and to allow students to do it at their pace where they need to. But again, that's just me as a layman. That's just how I see it.
Yeah, but I think we appreciate hearing that from you.
Yeah, and here's a connected question, not about the classroom, but about someone's home. So this person has said that they would love to bring some Indigenous perspectives or teachings into their home. And are there any traditions that a family could implement in their household that honors Indigenous peoples and the beautiful land that we all live on? So someone's wondering about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's the things that can sort of open the window to learning, right? And we know how land acknowledgments can do that. Of course, land acknowledgments are very simple statements and gestures, but they potentially can open up a whole lot of learning. And there are other ways to do that as well, like considering the food you eat, maybe. If you buy wild rice at the markets, maybe look up the origins of wild rice and how it's been farmed and harvested by Anishinaabe here since time immemorial. So I guess like little teachable moments like that, or sticking with the theme of food. I'm not hungry at all. I ate before we started. But like corn, beans, and squash, that's considered the three sisters. And Haudenosaunee culture, I think, pioneered that. Or, just music. If you have music to play in the background while you're eating or while you're gathering with your family and so on. So yeah, like, and art is an excellent way to do that too, whether it's books or films or visual arts or whatever else, so just these glimpses, these ways to open the window a little bit, I think are excellent, little things we can do without having to actually bring people into your home. But that's good too, as long as you offer them like food or whatever else. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend anyway. That's how I do it for myself. If I want to learn about Inuit culture, I'll look up an interview with Tani Tagak or Alethea Arna Burrell or somebody like that. So the internet's a very useful thing in terms of that learning.
It sure is. So you mentioned artwork as just now in your last response, and someone's wondering about your t-shirt. We can only see the top little bit of it, but what is the significance of the art on your t-shirt? If you know.
Yeah, this is a t-shirt my cousin made. Family affair tonight, obviously. Dave and then me and then our cousin. His name's Joshua Pewa-Steckley. And he goes by Waubgeshig. And he created this t-shirt a long time ago. It's a bear. So we're bear clay, and as you heard Dave say earlier, but yeah, he's Waubgeshig. He's a wonderful artist. He designs books, does all kinds of great digital art. So yeah, I try to represent his work whenever I can too.
It's lovely. I was admiring it too, so I'm glad someone asked the question about what was there. That's great. I'm connected and thinking to some of the conversation we've had thus far, and to the fact that you're a father and you've got two little ones, and I'm wondering, about some of the ways in which you're teaching them, about your own culture, and maybe some of the books or things that you're sharing with them to try to help.
Mm-hmm. Well, the pandemic has been hard with that because we haven't. Ideally, I would like to take them out to do, community events, to go to the Friendship Center here in Sudbury, or just visit with the relatives we have in Atikameksheng, which is just close by here, the First Nation near Sudbury. But that we haven't had those opportunities as much, unfortunately. So that's what I try to do most of, is bring them to people and have that hands-on learning available to them, whether it's like learning a song on a hand drum or watching somebody scrape a hide or something like that, right? But yeah, with the language itself, like, because I'm an ongoing learner, I tried to share my learning with them too. Because obviously it's more crucial for them to hear that at their age, and they obviously retain more at that age too, so that's part of it. But that's been a difficult endeavor at the same time, because our older son, who's 4, who was doing online school, he decided he didn't want to do it anymore. So we've been trying to engage him with other kinds of learning at the same time, but also giving him space too, because it has been a difficult time for him lately. So I hope, like, once things get back to normal, we all talk about this getting back to normal, that we'll be able to sort of schedule out or make more routine of that kind of learning. But yeah, it's just, they have more knowledge than I did at their age. So I see it as a plus regardless. And I think as they get older, it'll only snowball to a greater degree, but of course I have a responsibility as a parent to ensure they have those opportunities at the same time. But yeah, it's language, it's the art, it's the songs. But mostly it's just about being around other Anishinaabe people who still have the knowledge and the culture and so on, right? So
thank you for that. You've touched a little bit on this question. It's from Larry, who's on the line here with us tonight. And he's asked, as a parent, where do you hope your boys will go to school for their learning or go for their learning? And do you have any concerns or aspirations for them as a dad?
Oh yeah, I have big aspirations for them. Like, it would be amazing if they could go to an Anishinaabe immersion school from kindergarten on. That doesn't exist here in Sudbury. Rarely exists anywhere. And I think it is the obligation of the federal and provincial governments to fund programs like that. That should be accessible to all Indigenous people at no cost. But that is what part of reconciliation is, in my opinion, right? But that's not available to us right now. That is my dream, that they can do something like that. There is, I mentioned in Atikmishing, the First Nation near here, there is a land-based school, and we were hoping to get our first son into that, but then the pandemic sort of changed things at the same time, and they weren't offering in-person sort of learning. So we have him in the public system here, which is great. He is learning a lot. He excelled up until, it went strictly online. But I hope, like, as the younger one gets up to that age, like within the next 4 or 5 years or so, there will be more cultural opportunities for learning within the public system, specifically with language, right? Like, I want them to be able to have that accessible to them in the classroom from an early age. So that's my hope. That's what I want for them. In the meantime, like, I'll do my part to try to educate them as best as I can. But yeah, we need the political will from our leaders to give up the money to be able to do that, to provide that opportunity for everybody.
We're really proud and excited to be offering Mohawk language to support and in partnership
Amazing.
In high school next year. So we're embarking on the journey, because it's, as you say, it's super, super important that the language is available for Indigenous families and students particularly, but also for non-Indigenous members of the community that live in that area.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Learning together for sure. Jen, did you have another question?
There are a few about your writing process. And so someone was scoping out your tweets earlier today where you talked about writing as a teenager, and your teenage writings are now published as Midnight Sweat Lodge. And so you talked about it being a fun and creative outlet, and you could have never imagined being published in a book. And so what advice do you have for our adolescent listeners who might be writers? They have their own stories to tell. What would you say to them?
Oh, I would say just keep writing. Write as much as you can. And any act of, like, putting words together is writing. Any way that you express yourself through words and sentences and paragraphs and so on, that's what makes you a writer. You don't have to be published. You don't have to sort of meet anybody else's standards. Just that act of writing things out is the biggest first step you can make, I believe. And you don't have to rely on anybody else's designation or standards or anything else, and this is a discussion that comes up, like, in the wider literary community in Canada, idea, you know, like some people will say, well, you need a master's in fine arts to be an author. And some people will say, well, maybe you need to have at least an English degree or so on. But I know so many published authors that don't have any post-secondary experience, you know, they just wrote because they love doing it. And they learned by reading along the way. So read a lot and write a lot. That's how I learned about literature myself. You know, I went to school for journalism, obviously, and we had English courses mandatory throughout. So I did have that sort of critical understanding and learning of literature, but you know, I didn't really learn much about like style or format or techniques or anything like that. I wrote how I thought the story should be. Like I wrote it out in what I believed was the right way, and not trying to be anything else other than myself, you know. So stay true to yourself, and the story will come naturally. And of course, like it's never gonna be totally ready on the first shot. You're gonna have to like read it over and edit it a lot before you're comfortable with sharing with anybody else, or even maybe before you're comfortable with reading it on your own, you know. But yeah, that's just my advice, is to keep doing it. Like I worked full time as a journalist for a long time, and in my spare time, I wrote fiction. Just, you know, and I could call it a hobby, I guess, but I was really serious about it at the same time. I was using all my spare time to develop those skills, you know, and fortunately a year ago, I was able to make that shift from being a journalist to an author. So yeah, I would say just stick with it. Don't give up. And even if like you don't get to the place where you want to be early on, sometimes it takes a long time. There's an author named Jack Wang. He just recently published a collection of short stories and was very critically acclaimed, basically everywhere. But he wrote a tweet about a year ago saying that he first started pitching that book around like 18 years ago or so. So it took him 18 years to fulfill that dream. So, you know, hopefully it doesn't take that long for everybody else, but potentially that's how long it takes. But that means like the story is right and it's ready for the world. So yeah, just stick with it as best you can.
Thank you. I think that's great advice for some of our young listeners that are joining us here tonight. And I know I have been listening to your podcast, Story Keepers, and I know others have. We've been chatting about it over the virtual water cooler, and so I'm just wondering, you know, as you're thinking, you know, as you co-host that podcast, about the books that you chose, and sort of what was your process that you went through, and how did you decide which ones you were going to highlight to kick off and start the podcast?
Oh, that was really hard. We had a really long list of books that we wanted to do, like 30 to 40. And with the knowledge that we could only do one a month, you know, like Jennifer and I, we don't have the capacity to make it any more than once a month, right? Because of our work. And also like, we'd have to read more than one book a month, you know? And of course I do that already, but then we'd both have to like cram and do a book and then every couple of weeks, right? But yeah, you know, we wanted to reflect the diversity of Indigenous nations and cultures that I think was important. We do lean more heavily to the fiction side. And I think we decided to do that mostly because of the volume of fiction out there relative to like poetry and plays and nonfiction and so on. So I guess in the so-called canon of Indigenous literature, there's more fiction. So, you know, we decided to do mostly fiction, although we do have some poetry and plays and nonfiction books on the list. And we've already done some nonfiction, right? We wanted to have gender diversity. We wanted to weigh it equally between men and women, and we do want to reflect non-binary, trans, LGBT authors as well. So, you know, when you only do like one a month, though, that's only 12 in the year, right? So, you know, we've looked ahead a year, so we only have 12, but and we're trying to be flexible too. Like if we do have to swap one out, we're gonna do that. But yeah, that went into the decision-making process. And the difficult thing about that is like, you can't please everybody, you know, and we've heard that from people already saying, oh, why don't you do this, this, and this? And we're just like, well, sorry, we're only two people doing this for fun. Like we're not, you know, doing it to make money or anything like that, you know? So yeah, but it's fun because like, because both of us are so passionate about it, and both of us read so much, we don't really script anything. We just sort of record these casual conversations, and that's the most fun part for me, coming out of CBC, where everything really has to be planned to a T, right? So to take this sort of informal approach to producing audio is super fun for me. So yeah, I don't know how long we'll go for. Like, we'll go for at least the next year and a half or so, depending on what happens with each of us individually, professionally and personally. But for the time being, it's a lot of fun, and we really appreciate those of you who are interested in it. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, for sure. It's been a favorite of mine since you started. Cool. That's great. That's great. I think we have time maybe for one more question, and I just want to acknowledge everyone who's watching us tonight, and thank you so much for sharing questions and sharing them with us. We've really enjoyed being able to help have this conversation on your behalf with Waub. It's been really great. And so Jen, did you have one more that you wanted, that you had highlighted you wanted to share, or do you want me to pick one?
No, it's good. I think I'll go with this one. So I think it's a teacher's voice, again, asking this question. They're wondering about embedding storytelling opportunities with elders into their students' educational experience. And so thinking, how might they approach that? Any suggestions?
Oh, I think that's a great idea. I think that's probably the best way to do it, actually. Even better than books, quite honestly. I would say the best way is to reach out to like your neighboring community, whatever is closest by. Try to see if there are resources or contacts within your board that know of elders who do visits, and reach out to other boards too, because there are these networks of school boards who have dedicated like FNMI educators or offices or whatever else, right? So yeah, I would try to take advantage of the resources and contacts you have. When you're bringing somebody in, like, again, this goes back to the flexibility I mentioned earlier, like give them the entire time if you can, make sure they're compensated for their time as well, whether, of course, with money, but also like with a suitable gift, whether it's tobacco or coffee or whatever else. And yeah, be mindful that not all Indigenous cultures use tobacco either. So, you learn that through whatever context you have in sort of arranging the visit or whatever else. But I highly recommend that. I think that is probably the best way to learn about culture and history is through our elders, the ones we still have, right? So yeah.
Miigwech, thank you so much for that. I'd like to invite my friend Kelly Moore, who's here with us on the call tonight. She is going to say a thanks on behalf of all of us.
Wow, that was amazing. I'm here. I feel like I've got a great honor to say thank you, Waub. A big miigwech to you and your stories and your podcast for inspiring us all. You had said earlier that, for change to happen, we need opportunities to come together to understand and to learn. And I feel like you've given us one of those opportunities today. So again, miigwech for that. And I wanted to kind of draw a parallel that I found in listening to you, and I hope that you see it. You were talking about your upbringing and how you grew up with storytelling in your life on the res, and then you went, to Parry Sound, to a new school, and you had to read from books. And later on in the conversation, you were talking about, the pandemic and what's going on in the pandemic, and you found it quite amusing that people were taking comfort in literature. And it brought me right back to my upbringing, as well as maybe yours, is they're finding that same comfort that we do as Indigenous people, listening to our elders and knowledge keepers sharing that knowledge with us. So as you talk about the many circles that you've been on your life, I hope that you take this with you and know that, you are providing many people with comfort, and you're opening doors for discussion and change. So from the bottom of my heart, and for everybody here at TLDSB and everybody out there watching, thank you, miigwech.
Chimigwech, thank you very much. That is a great honor. I am very thankful for this opportunity. I just really enjoyed my discussion with you all tonight. I commend you all for the great work you're doing as educators and as community bridgers and so on. So thanks again for this opportunity. Feel free to get in touch with me anytime. Always available. So Chimigwech, thank you.
Chimigwech, Waub. So just before we go tonight, I had asked Elder Christopher Stock from Wata Mohawks to please close our circle in a good way.
Thank you, Waub, for everything that you've mentioned. And I do remember during that time period, we used to share all the socials together. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. And yeah, we felt the same way when we would come up to Perry Sound to the Friendship Center, and it's like, oh, we got to dance the other way. So I want to thank you for that. And so at this time, I want to ask that each and every one of us to listen well for a short time, as the time has come to give greetings of love, thanks, honor, and respect to the Creator for everything that He has given us. And I'll say it all in Mohawk, and I'll do a very short closing for everybody. Ganjokwa se wata hunsios kat negari we sa ungwe soa negari da sitwe no mordado ne sungwa ediso ne wahia kwe gorosa anyo tino hoda de oto wanre ne ti wantade danone ona de tino mordado ne ungwe soa de tino mordado ne yiti ni staha tio hunzate de tino mordado ne ti kanakaronyo de tino mordado ne katsun soa de tino mordado ne oterda soa de tino mordado ne otinuma soa de tino mordado ne gahi soa de tino mordado ne jun hekwa ne gari ne honeste o se heta deno ne ona umserda de tino mordado ne undirio de tino mordado ne ozita ongoa de tino mordado ne gardon da soa deno ogre soa de tino mordado ne gayuri ne gawardage ne gadi ne otardage nago anjegene deno enego de tino mordado ne radiverdas de tino mordado ne yonki sota son tonka karakwa de yago suaterum tini wasundas the situe mordado ne son guazio jokaneka karakwa de hosuaterum de tino mordado ne zio gisto quardonio de hodi suaterum tini wasundas danone ona the situe mordado ne son guaidiso ona toni ore o gader di wat quene toga teno son gene gorham ise gene se wa guadago dano ae se wa der da shiohake dano scano toga di nayoto no guane gordo toni wanege yawa
Yawa.
no
Yawa.
Yawa and Miigwech. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. It's our honor to have welcomed you here and to have Waub share with us. So thank you again, and we hope to see you again really soon. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Mama
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Onegiwahe.
Good night, all.
Okay.
Chimigwech.